Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Dr. Kathleen Tunney was born in Cadillac, Michigan. She obtained her bachelor's degree in social services at Ferris State University in Michigan, her master's degree in social work from Western Michigan University, and her doctoral degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Today, she is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Social Work at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Say with Dr. Tunney.
Well, thank you for having me.
Although the terminology is clear, I'm not sure that many people really know what a social worker does.
Oh my gosh, what does a social worker not do? As I'm fond of saying, we're everywhere and we're invisible. Social workers are in correctional facilities for adults and juveniles. We're in hospitals, we're in hospice, we're in schools, we're in mental health and substance abuse agencies and nursing homes. The role of the social worker has often been considered to be, oh, you're those people who hand out money and take people's children away. And child welfare is only one small slice of what social workers do. The profession has been in existence for over 110 years, although we don't look a day over 80. We're relatively new in the human services professional field. But yes, we provide over 80% of the mental health care in the United States. Very unknown piece of information. So we're everywhere and we're invisible.
Okay. So how come do you become interested in social work?
How did I become interested? Well, at one time I wanted to be a high school English teacher, and probably many of my students still think I'm a frustrated English teacher based on my comments on their papers. I think what happened is that as a young woman, I looked around me and I saw a lot of the problems of students in my high school and really realized there needed to be a more unified, networked approach to some of the problems. It took me a while to get there. I was a non-traditional student, started college at 28 years of age with 2 kids and a part-time job to contend with, but I was determined that I wanted to be a part of that. I also worked at a crisis intervention center as a volunteer. And some of the paid staff members that I worked with said, you know what, you have a knack for this. You should do it. And as a young housewife, I thought, me? Who, me? And decided to let their belief in me drive some career choices. And that's similar to what social workers do. Oftentimes we see things in our clients and vulnerable people who that they don't see in themselves. So I'm a living example of how that principle actually worked.
Now, it's clear from this that social work is a very practical profession. It's very hands-on type of thing.
Yeah.
So how come do you decide to become a college professor on top of that?
Oh, gosh, maybe that goes back to the frustrated English teacher piece. But I've always wanted to teach. I think that in some sense, being a good social work practitioner is similar to teaching in that you try to help people's lives become better because of your involvement. You try to help people see the world differently as a result of your presence in their world. And so I think the teaching piece was always a part of what I wanted to do from the beginning. I worked as a psychiatric social worker and a family crisis intervention for 10 years post-master's degree, and really felt the need to teach and knew that I wanted to do that permanently, and the way to do that was a PhD degree.
Now, one of the courses that you teach is human behavior theory.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you something that has always been in my mind, which is, what do you think makes humans to be sometimes extremely good and sometimes extremely bad?
Oh my goodness, you have done your homework. Gosh, I think it's the social work perspective, which speaks to me, which is probably why I teach it and did it as a practitioner, is that it's a dance between person and environment. The most recent research on resilience and human behavior suggests that people have within them the capacity to grow and change given the right physical environment and emotional environment to do that in. I think that the best available evidence suggests that how we are is about half heredity and half environment. And the social work perspective is that dance between person and environment. Our professional charge is to look at the fit between person and environment, to work with the individual and to also work with that environment. If you have a vulnerable individual who experiences a certain environment at a certain point in their development, then the outcome can be very different.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier that you have been dealing a lot in the area of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, we have seen recently some statistics showing that there's an increasing number of people who are being diagnosed with some conditions, like, for example, autism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering is there a reason to believe there are more people with autism, or is it because we are getting better at diagnosing that and other mental conditions?
Well, this is not a trick answer, but the answer is yes to both. I think it appears, and again, learning disorders and learning disabilities are not my area of specialization, but what I can say, it's another example of that person and environment construct, that there could be things in our physical environment that contribute to an increasing rate. There also is the fact that our environment is more attuned to those things, so we're diagnosing at a greater rate. That's happened with child abuse and neglect as well. As recently as 30 or so years ago, there were no federal or state statutes that required mandated reporting of child abuse and neglect. That's changed.
And do you think that physicians, first responders, and the like are now better trained to spot that sort of situations?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes even more important that there be the secondary level of assessment that says, we think there's something going on here, and we need to take a closer look and have trained assessors, mm-hmm.
both
in child abuse and neglect, mental health, substance abuse, and learning disorders as well.
The other issue, of course, is the fact that because of the financial situation, we see a lot of indigent people mm-hmm. around. And apparently also there has been an improved way to find some sort of mental conditions with many
mm-hmm.
of them.
Mm-hmm.
I know you have been looking into that. So what is the latest that we know in terms of the relationship between indigent individuals and mental issues?
Gosh, that's another example of the person-environment construct. If you have nutrition plays a role in learning and development, access to mental stimulation plays a role in learning and development. So without those early influences, it's difficult for children to succeed. The stigma associated with that. Although, just to take that in a slightly different direction in terms of children who experience homelessness, the McKinney-Vento Act provides specifically for services in public schools and other school settings for children who are homeless, to attempt to recoup some of the losses that kids without a stable family life can experience, which, of course, homelessness and poverty obviously go hand in hand.
Now, you talked earlier about how environment influences all these type of conditions, but I wonder if environment as well as legislation makes the work of social workers different from one country to another, because I have observed the role of social workers in European countries or Latin American countries. They differ in the way they approach these issues than in the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is true in other helping professions. The Western model, the U.S. specifically, since that's the one that I obviously know the best, takes a more individualized position, because as a culture we tend to be more individualized. And some of the work that I did in Eastern Europe and the travels I've been able to go on before and after that suggests that it's a different model. The International Association of Social Workers takes a much more human rights model, more culturally community-oriented than does the American model. So issues of child welfare, issues of mental health conditions are you're right, they're treated very differently in other countries, treated in a less clinical, psychiatric, psychological standpoint, and more from the notion of improving and enhancing and enriching the environment.
Because when I see in Europe, I mean, I think you're right about what you mentioned about individualized approach in the U.S., In Europe, you find a more cohesive, more social network, trying to help those individuals. And in fact, as you said earlier, they seem to have an approach that is more social oriented than clinical oriented. And I wonder if you also find some differences in those approaches within the United States, given that different states have different laws regarding social work.
I know that in Michigan, my home state, licensure for social workers lagged behind the rest of the country. At one time, Michigan was one of only 4 states in the U.S. that did not have licensure for social work, which also enhances the credibility of the profession but protects the public as well. So varying state to state in terms of what budgets have to offer, in terms of the philosophy of those in charge of decision-making at that time, yeah, huge difference.
Because I suspect, for example, out in the West, as well in the southern United States, the approach is different from the Northeast, where they not only have more resources, but probably a better comprehension of the issue from a social viewpoint. Have you noticed a difference among the United States themselves?
I think the big difference that I saw in the difference between, having lived in Chicago for my PhD studies and living in Michigan and now in a metropolitan area is the rural versus urban difference. My specialization in my Master of Social Work degree was rural social work. And I think that one of the big differences that comes is in the amount of resources that are available in rural areas versus urban areas. Now, if you think about poverty, back to that, urban poverty looks very different than rural poverty. Urban substance abuse, in many ways, looks very different than rural. That's a dichotomy that I think is pretty stark, even in our own region. Counties with few resources, while the resource density in St. Louis and even in Edwardsville may be greater, in rural areas there's a severe lack of ability, and there's more visibility of those people with problems.
You make it sound like, in a way, social workers have to be trained differently depending on which type of cultural, social environment they work.
Absolutely. And social workers are trained very broadly. As you mentioned earlier, we do human behavior theories from the standpoint and the perspective of person and environment in that dance. We also are trained to do clinical social work. We're trained to do policy advocacy, social welfare policy analysis. But within that broad training, absolutely, the specializations that are enhanced and deepened through our field practicum experiences help people decide which part of that broad field that they choose to drill down and have a deeper, richer understanding of.
Also, it sounds like part of the training for a social worker is also how to deal with people in the medical profession, people in the legal profession, people and the state bureaucracy and all that kind of things. So I guess part of the training has to do with how to be kind of interdisciplinary in order to deal with that. So how is that training goes?
How does it happen?
Yeah.
What happens is we have courses both at the graduate and the undergraduate level that looks at human behavior theory related to neighborhoods, organizations, and communities. And within that, and the organizational segment of that, both grad and undergrad, we take a look at how does your agency function? Who are you within that agency structure? What are some of the political and economic factors you need to be aware of in the human services system? Because the systems connect. I often tell students, sometimes we're talking about the same families with substance abuse problems, poverty, mental health issues, isolation from their communities, stigma from their communities. While we may treat those dimensions differently, we're talking about the same people in many cases. And so those networks that you have to work with your client around a substance abuse problem, you may be working with a child welfare worker, you may be working with a mental health worker, a public aid worker. It's all interconnected. So we have to help students realize that no matter how good you are at what you do, when you close the door and say, how can I help you, the rest of the world is still outside that door and is going to affect your ability to be of use to that person. It's hard for students to grasp that. They come in wanting to be good helpers. They're sincere, they're intelligent, but we try to help them understand that the world outside their door has as big or bigger impact on what they can do, and help them take seriously. There's a story about social workers. One social worker is rescuing people who are drowning in a river, and she's hauling people up and putting them on the banks, and soon another social worker comes along to help. And they're both pulling people out of the water, rescuing them. The second social worker starts to walk away, and the first says, "Where are you going? We have to save these people." The second goes, "I'm going upriver to see why they keep falling in." And going upriver is social welfare policy advocacy, it's work at the organizational level, it's program evaluation, it's a variety of different macro level tasks. Because while we need people downstream to help people from falling in, individual level intervention, we need people upriver as well.
Do you feel that because the prevalence now of nonprofit organizations that deal with specific issues like battered women or drug users and that sort of things, you are interacting even more with those nonprofit organizations that actually with governmental organizations?
Often, because the new model, of course, is contractual services. 100 years ago when I started as a practitioner, government agencies offered services directly. People were employees of the federal or state government providing services directly. The new model, as I'm sure you know, is a contractual model. The state of Illinois contracts with other agencies to provide services. So those agencies really are one step removed from the policymakers in Springfield or Jefferson City, and those are the organizations that we work most closely with. So understanding the funding models, all of that is a part of social work training to help students and practitioners understand that they're part of a larger system.
Now, listening to you, I was wondering, obviously because of the kind of work that you do, you get very into the inside of the situations of families or groups. And sometimes I'm sure you observe some criminal behavior going on. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if sometimes you may say, well, if I go to the authorities and denounce this particular crime, I may generate more harm than good in solving the problem. How do social workers are trained in order to deal with those moral dilemmas?
Well, we have a code of ethics. It's out there for the public to see. Our students agree to abide by that code. We also have to be aware of our agency parameters, agency policy, which we hope is always in line with state law, federal law. We also have an obligation for client confidentiality. There are circumstances under which that can be breached. We teach our students and our practitioners in the field that work with students reinforce this, is that if you walk into the room, the boilerplate, the initial statement is, if there's anything that you tell me that suggests that you're a harm to yourself or harm to others, then I need to act on that information. And there's a great deal more to that. The law is also publicly available. But we have to make sure that clients know. It's a principle of informed consent, that if we feel that that person is in imminent danger of harming themselves or another person, then that has to be dealt with to protect that person or the others.
Now, obviously, people who get into the social work profession are people who care about other people. Mm-hmm. So these are people with values, with caring inclinations towards society. But I was wondering to what extent you have to be careful not to have your personal values influencing the way you practice your profession.
A great deal, and I think that you should come and join our program. You can be an honorary social worker. Your thought process is consistent with the questions that we want our students to answer and ask. I think that what we try to do is, again, point to our ethical code. There is the principles of the profession include service to the client, dignity and worth of the person, and there are some of our clients that you might not be surprised to hear are very difficult to respect. Persons who harm others, persons who harm children, persons who are engaged in behavior that makes them stigmatized by society. We have to come back to dignity and worth of the person, and we have to emphasize the way in which that person is still a human being. I tell my students, if they're not a human being, what are they? They're not a rutabaga or some other inanimate object. They're persons, and we struggle with that. We challenge our students, and sometimes my job is to make them uncomfortable, to question those values, to challenge their biases, because we all have them, and the question is to overcome and to struggle with that.
Now, in an individualized society like the United States, and where people don't like to see bad things, they want to ignore bad things, I wonder if somehow society today has lost the ability to care for others. Is there something out there along those lines?
I think so. One of the phrases used to describe it is compassion fatigue. It's a big issue. Sometimes we call it burnout in the human professions, is where you see so much tragedy and so much that seems hopeless and insurmountable that there's a tendency to just shut down. And that's a big challenge to human services workers, because we try to advocate for the needs of vulnerable people and to help people see a broader scope of why that person ended up where they ended up. But people have a very difficult time listening. So it's a very common challenge in our society. I would absolutely agree with that.
Now, in addition to all the, I would even say, scientific approach you can have at training social workers, and given that a main component of the social worker job is to be a counselor, to counseling people, how do you assess that one of your students has reached that point where you can see this? You can say this person does have good counseling skills.
How do we know that? Well, we have in our department, I'm a part of our program that I'm very proud of. We have counseling skills labs. We have digital recording equipment. Students from their undergraduate career all the way through their advanced graduate career come to labs, and in small groups they interact with a simulated client, with the instructor, graduate assistants helping. And we use student fees, and we pay people to be trained as clients. And so that we put those trained simulated clients into the lab, and students get feedback on their skills based on the focus of the course. They get feedback from their peers, from the simulated client, and from me as their instructor. So we have a better opportunity to gauge how skilled they are when they go into their field practicum sites, because these courses occur either before or during their field practicum experience in a real human service agency. We're proud of that because we use simulated clients probably to a greater degree than most programs in the U.S. that I'm aware of. We use them both at the undergraduate, junior level, all the way up through second-year graduate students. So we have a little bit better feel for how skilled they are. For many students, it's a very eye-opening experience. It's different than role-playing with your buddy from class who is somebody you know. To have someone that you don't know, you've never met, but they're trained to portray a client's case makes it more real. Students typically tell us, it scares me to death, I want to do it more. So we're pretty proud of our ability to be more sure. And for some students, that means that they find that they don't really want to do this work. And that's okay, because we want people to find the fit that's right for them and serve clients effectively in the field.
Okay. Now, I have been invited by your department in numerous occasions to give some welcoming remarks at workshops that you offer and other occasions. And something I've noticed is the preponderance of women in the profession. Why do you think is that?
Well, I think part of it is women, right, wrong, or indifferent, are arguably seen as the caretakers in our society. We're the ones who may be more attuned to others' emotions, who may care for children more frequently than males. So I think that's part of it. Part of it, quite frankly, is salaries. I know that historically in the nursing profession it was predominantly female. When men started to enter the profession in greater numbers, salaries went up. So I think that that's part of it. The National Association of Social Workers, I believe the membership is something like 80% white women, and certainly racial and ethnic minorities are drawn to the profession in part because of its social justice emphasis. But to get more men into the profession is a challenge, and it always has been. It's an underrepresented group in our profession.
And now that you mentioned ethnic diversity, I was wondering if, for example, if you are dealing with an issue that is happening in an African-American family, wouldn't an African-American be better prepared culturally, regardless of the preparation she or he got in college, to understand what's going on in that particular environment?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Because another intersection here is that of class, social class. A well-educated, upper-middle-class African-American person may have less in common than a single mom from East St. Louis than would a single mom from one of our more less ethnically diverse communities. So there's a social class intersect there too, and an education intersect as well as a racial or ethnic one, because social work, especially at the undergraduate level, tends to be young females. We try really hard through a required diversity class, which really challenges. If we challenge them in the counseling skills lab, our diversity course really addresses those issues and tries to help people who maybe have not had a lot of exposure, who may have been in the first time at SIUE in a class with an African American student colleague, to understand how the limits of your understanding, which goes back to the issues of values and ethics that you were talking about earlier. We have to respect the diversity within diversity and not make assumptions. There's some authors who believe that cultural competence is a myth because people are such individuals and that their racial or ethnic identity or their gender or any other descriptor is only a part of who they are. And it gets cast through the prism of experience that is unique.
And that's basically because there are probably more similarities between poor whites and poor blacks than between poor blacks and middle-class blacks.
That's what some authors are saying, and I've seen that to some extent to be true.
Okay. Now, you work on something called a spiritual assessment, and I was intrigued by that. What do you mean by a spiritual assessment?
Well, that was an article that my colleague, Dr. Wesley, and I, and one of our graduate students actually wrote together some years back. And what we were looking at is, what do hospice workers feel they need to know to do an adequate job of working with people from a variety of different faith-based traditions or spiritual traditions? Typically, maybe stereotypically, people think about people coming into a hospice center as being somehow turning toward God or their higher power. And yet, people in hospice services come from a lot of faith traditions and sometimes no faith tradition. So our effort was to determine, what do hospice workers really need to know to work with people from a Muslim tradition or from a Jewish tradition or from maybe a spiritual tradition that's unfamiliar to them or to many in our society. So that was our intention.
Okay. Well, in the 30 seconds that we have left,
all right.
Very simple question. What is your next big project?
My next big project? Oh, gosh. I'd like to say rescheduling that camping trip, but I don't think that that's what you have in mind. My next big project would be to complete an article that colleagues and I are working on our simulation technology. We gathered some data a year or so ago on the simulated client's experience in our program, and we're working on writing that up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Kathleen Tunney of the Department of Social Work at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, for this interesting conversation about social work. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Richard Brugman of the Department of Biological Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, who will be talking about poisons in our waters. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.